Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Marcia Marley, Chair of the Montclair Literary Festival and Executive Director of Succeed Together. By buying your ticket tonight, you are not just getting a riveting novel and a scintillating discussion this evening. You are also supporting Succeed Together's programs, a nonprofit that addresses unequal access to educational resources by providing free, high-quality enrichment and academic programs, as well as a post-high school path to a successful career for children in need from Montclair and Essex County, New Jersey. We at Succeed Together believe every child deserves what only a few can afford. Please visit our website at succeedtogether.org to learn more about the organization and our programs. The S2G Literary Festival would not be possible without our many generous sponsors, hosts, and partners, many which are here today. Rather than list them all, you can look at them in our two sponsor boards. We are deeply grateful to our sponsors and to your ongoing support. I also want to thank our gracious host tonight, the Unitarian Universalist Congregation at Montclair. Tonight we are thrilled to welcome Maggie O'Farrell and Liz Harris. Maggie O'Farrell, a novelist from Northern Ireland, has worked as a journalist in Hong Kong and as a deputy literary editor of The Independent on Sunday in London. She also taught creative writing at the University of Warwick in Coventry and Goldsmith College in London. Her numerous and successful novels have received widespread critical acclaim and have been translated into over 30 languages. 3 of her novels have been shortlisted for the Costa Award, with A Hand That First Held Mine winning the 2010 award for Best Novel. Her memoir, I am, 17 Brushes with Death, I'm going to buy this one actually, reached the top of the Sunday Times bestseller list. Her novel, Hamnet, won the Women's Prize for Fiction and the National Book Critics Circle Award for Fiction in 2020. I agree, a great novel. Our moderator tonight, Elisabeth A. Harris, has been a New York Times reporter since 2009. Liz currently writes about books and publishing for the Times. Her work has been honored with awards from different press clubs. Thank you both for joining us tonight. O'Farrell's most recent novel, which they will discuss and which you are holding in your hand, The Marriage Portrait, set in late Renaissance Italy, is full of intrigue and danger. We will take audience questions at the end of the talk. Thank you both again.
Thank you everyone for coming. That was a great start. So I think Maggie is going to kick it off with a reading from her new book.
So I'm going to start at the very beginning, chapter 1, and this is called A Wild and Lonely Place. Lucrezia is taking her seat at the long dining table, which is polished to a watery gleam and spread with dishes, inverted cups, a woven circlet of fur. Her husband is sitting down, not in his customary place at the opposite end, but next to her, close enough that she could rest her head on his shoulder, should she wish. He is unfolding his napkin and straightening a knife and moving the candle towards them both when it comes to her with a peculiar clarity, as if some coloured glass has been put in front of her eyes, or perhaps, okay, sorry. Or, I think I may be a bit taller. Or perhaps removed from them, that he intends to kill her. She is 16 years old, not quite a year into her marriage. They have travelled for most of the day, using what little daylight the season offers, leaving Ferrara at dawn and riding out to what he had told her was a hunting lodge far in the northwest of the province. But this is no hunting lodge, is what Lucrezia had wanted to say when they reached their destination, a high-walled edifice of dark stone flanked on one side by dense forest and on the other by a twisting meander of the Po River. She would have liked to turn in her saddle and ask, "Why have you brought me here?" She said nothing, however, allowing her mare to follow him along the path, through dripping trees, over the arched back bridge and into the courtyard of the strange, fortified, star-shaped building, which seemed even then to strike her as peculiarly empty of people. The horses have been led away. She has removed her sodden cloak and hat, and he has watched her do this, standing with his back to the blaze in the grate. And now he is gesturing to the country servants in the hall's outer shadows to step forward and place food on their plates, to pour wine in their cups. And she is suddenly recalling the words of her sister-in-law delivered in a hoarse whisper. "You will be blamed." Lucrezia's fingers grip the rim of her plate. The certainty that he means her to die is like a presence beside her, as if a dark feathered bird of prey has alighted on the arm of her chair. This is the reason for their sudden journey to such a wild and lonely place. He has brought her here to this stone fortress to murder her. Astonishment yanks her up out of her body, and she almost laughs. She is hovering by the vaulted ceiling, looking down at herself and him, sitting at the table, putting broth and salted bread into their mouths. He is setting an elbow on either side of his plate, telling her about coming to this lodge, as he persists in calling it, when he was a child, how his father used to bring him hunting here. She is listening to a story about how he was made to release arrow after arrow towards a target on a tree until his fingers bled. She is nodding and making sympathetic murmurs at appropriate moments, but what she really wants to do is look him in the eye and say, "I know what you are up to." Would he be surprised, wrong-footed? Does he think of her as his innocent, unworldly wife, barely out of the nursery? She sees it all. She sees he has laid his scheme so carefully, so assiduously, separating her from others, ensuring that her retinue is left behind in Ferrara, that she is alone, that there are no people from the Castello here, just him and her, 2 guards stationed outside, and a handful of country servants to wait on them. How will he do it? Part of her would like to ask him this. The knife in a dark corridor, his hands about her throat, a tumble from a horse made to look like an accident. She has no doubt that all of these would fall within his repertoire. It had better be done well, would be her advice to him, because her father is not someone who will take a lenient view of his daughter's murder. She sets down her cup, she lifts her chin, she turns her eyes onto her husband, Alfonso, Duke of Ferrara, and she wonders what will happen next. Thank you very much for listening.
Did this work? There we go. Hi. Well, thank you everyone for coming. So shall we jump right in with the marriage portrait and start there? I really like this story. So where did the idea for this book come from?
Is that better? Oh yeah, that's better. So I know, well actually unusually I think, because most novels or ideas for novels tend to creep up on you, I think very, very gradually. They kind of gather behind your back, and I think almost at that stage you've got to not turn around too quickly and face them, because they're quite shy, novel ideas. But I think this one was the exception to the rule in that it almost arrived fully formed and fell into my lap. I wish that happened more often, but unfortunately it doesn't. And I know exactly when it was. It was February 2020, and I was waiting outside my friend's house for my daughter to come out of a play date, which actually turned out to be the last one she had for a very long time, because before lockdown began. And I had been rereading Robert Browning's poems, particularly his dramatic monologues. And I was just wondering, I was sitting there idly, I was uncharacteristically early, which is not like me, and I was just thinking to myself, I wonder if the most famous of his poems, My Last Duchess, is based on real events and real people. And so I was looking it up on my phone, and within a minute or two I had the name, Lucrezia de Medici, and a few minutes after that her portrait was downloading very slowly on my phone, and I could see this jewelled headdress, and then this wide, very pale brow, and then these rather anxious looking brown eyes. And as soon as I had a full picture of her face, And because she looks, I think, quite anxious, she looks worried and apprehensive, as well she might, I just knew that I had my next novel. It was really strange. It was like a kind of lightning bolt, and I knew that I think because she looked as though she had something she wanted to say, she looked as though she had a story to tell. And of course the poem is about her husband, Alfonso, and he's talking and he is showing around the representative of his next wife's family, and he reveals to them this portrait behind a curtain, and he is quite happy to share the information that he had this wife, his previous wife, murdered. And I just felt it was time to pull back that curtain and say, okay, Lucrezia, it's your turn to tell your story now.
And why was it loading so slowly on your phone?
Because I'm not very interested in technology, and I use a phone which has been rejected by my teenage son. Because, you know, why not? So, and I'm also not very good at searching things on the internet, so yeah, that's why.
Good reasons, all good reasons. You mentioned your reading, to jump around a little bit, and we all know that Maggie is a very accomplished and prolific novelist. I think you've written 11 books. Correct me if I'm wrong, including
I think
Memoir.
it's 10.
Is it 10?
We can say 11.
Let's say it's 11. Let's say it's 12. It's fine. It's fine.
20.
She's written 100 books, so that's been great. But in fact, you may not know about Maggie is that she is an insomniac and very productive about it. So, tell us, how much sleep do you generally get a night, and what do you do with the rest of your night?
Well, it does vary, and I have had insomnia all my life. I think it's genetic. My grandmother was a real insomniac, and one of my children, unfortunately, I think inherited it from me. But my grandmother did this thing when I was probably about 14 or 15. She got me by the shoulders, and she did that thing which grandmothers in storybooks do. She said, "Don't ever, ever take sleeping pills." So I was like, "Okay, I promise I won't." So actually, instead of taking sleeping pills, as I promised my grandmother, my dead grandmother, that I wouldn't, I read books. Because actually, insomnia is a pain, as anyone who knows, and there are lots and lots of drawbacks. But, if you turn it upside down, you think, well, the big advantage is that you have a lot more time. And there's a lot of reading time. So if I'm going to have this, family failing, I'm going to make the most of it. So, some nights I only sleep 3 or 4 hours. But it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of I think if you fight insomnia and you think this is making me miserable, then it is going to make you miserable. But if you think, well, great, I'm just going to get a lot of reading done, you have to look at the positives, I think. So, no, I do sometimes. My husband says that sometimes, we'll get into bed and we'll start reading, and he reads 3 or 4 pages, and then the next morning he wakes up and I say, "Oh, great, I finished my book. It's really good." And I've read it all book. He thinks, "How did you do that?" There have been times where I've actually read his book as well as mine, which really annoys me.
That must be very irritating.
It's really irritating. No, I'm sorry. It's not good.
That's wonderful. What do you read?
Pretty much everything and anything, actually. That said, I'm quite omnivorous in my reading, but I do really favour fiction. I think fiction's my big love in life, which probably isn't a huge shock to everybody. But I read I try to reread. I read classics and I reread really favourite books every now and again. I have a kind of select group of books that I'll read every 2, 3, 5 years or whatever. But I also read a lot of new things that are coming out. I love to know what people are up to. I love to know what people are thinking and creating. So I'll read novels. There's only one point, I think, in the process, in the sort of life cycle of writing a novel that I don't read other novels, and that's only the space of about maybe 3 weeks, and it's right at the end when you're doing the absolute final draft and you're fiddling around with your semicolons and thinking, I'm going to move that adjective and I'm going to cut out that adverb, and at that point, I just feel as though my head is so full of the book, and in a sense, I used to be a waitress, and it's a bit like carrying this incredibly heavy platter laden with cups and...
Me too, I was very bad at it.
Yeah, I was really bad at it too. But it just, you're balancing it all on one hand and you can't tilt it at all because something will fall off. And it feels like that. So at that point, I'll read short stories and poetry. Particularly, you Americans are so good at short stories. I don't know why or how you do it, but it's just... I always tend to gravitate towards Amy Bloom or Edith Perlman or Raymond Carver. So at that point, I think my brain can just about cope with the short form of a short story.
You're welcome about the short stories. And usually, just personal curiosity, excuse me, what are the ones you return to, the books you reread?
Well, I would always reread Anna Karenina and Jane Eyre. What else do I reread? Something I reread recently is William Boyd's The New Confessions, which is a really fantastic novel. Olive Kittredge is something I've read lots of times. What else? I really love, there's a trilogy by a writer called Jane Gardam, which is called the Old Filth Trilogy, which is just so good. Really, people are nodding, yeah. I think I read it for the 6th time recently, all 3 of them. I thought I was just going to dip into the beginning of the book 1, but then about a few days later I found myself searching frantically my shelves for number 3. So yeah, I absolutely love that trilogy.
As you're reading, do you think like, ooh, I want to do that but do it better, or anything like that? Like, do you sort of think as a writer while you're reading, or are you just lost in the reading?
Well, I think an initial reading, I think I'm reading as a reader. You know, I'm galloping to get to the end usually, and I want to know what happens. I want to know what happens to these characters or how the plot resolves. But if I really like a book, then I will go back to it, and I think of it as reading as a writer. So, and I think of, you know, you have to kind of take it apart in a sense, a bit like an engineer would take apart an engine, you know, just to kind of examine it, to see how it all works and understand it, and then you reassemble it. So I do have a very, my son calls it my nerd book, where I have a notebook where I have drawn diagrams of plots of novels that I really love, to work at how the mechanics of it, the sort of science of it in a sense.
Nerd book. Teenagers are so nice. Yeah. Well, let's see. And so Hamnet was your first sort of big hit in the U.S. I guess had many, many hits in the U.K. and has obviously been very successful for a long time. But that was sort of a big sort of turning point for you in the United States. And I feel like, you know, it must be somewhat disorienting to have that happen on Zoom. And now here you are, and your first sort of, you know, the first publication since all that happened. And I wonder, does it feel any different now?
Well, I don't know, I've always felt that it's not very good for you as a writer if you spend any time examining how you are received in any sense at all, whether it's a review or, you know, book sales or any of those kind of numbers or anything like that. I think it's actually bad for you, or it's bad for me, certainly. I think I have to write in this hermetic bubble of unself-consciousness, and I think the minute you start, I don't know, analysing or thinking about how people see you or what people like about your books, it's really bad for you. I think you have to just write. I think the best book you're going to write is always the one you can't not write. It's always going to be the one that's shouting the loudest or tugging at your sleeve most insistently. So I try really hard not to think about it, and I actually don't read any of my reviews or any press. I did actually read your interview though, my husband said I should, so thank you. I don't read any of them apart from Liz's. Just because I think it's not good for you to hear yourself explained, you know, because I think however much you think, I'm not reading this nice review and I'm not going to let it into my brain, when you sit down to write, you don't ever want to hear any kind of little voice at the back of your head saying she is this or she does that or she likes to do X or Y. I think it's bad for you.
Except for my voice.
Except for Liz, which is the exception.
Not creepy at all. Totally fine. I'll just call you. It'll be fine. Great. And, you know, that sort of reminds me of something we spoke about. So I wrote a profile of Maggie over the summer, which is where this came from. And I think, was it you or your husband who told me about you refuse to talk to him about what you're writing about, and you don't talk to him, you don't talk to people. I mean, so how's your sort of, you know, this process that's kicking around in your head, but you don't let anyone in? How do you approach that? Mm-hmm.
Well, I always feel that the first draft is a very special experience, and so I don't tell anyone what I'm writing on. You know, I don't tell my editor or my agent or my husband or my friends. And I think the first draft has to be created in this very. I mean, I suppose it goes back to what I was saying about this kind of bubble of unself-consciousness. It just has to be you and the page and a dialogue between you and your characters, but also the sense that it's almost, I think, until you've got to the end of your first draft, until you've sort of pinned down what it is you want to say, the idea is almost too fragile to be, you know, it's like there's those sort of historical artifacts that can't be exposed to oxygen. It does feel a bit like that to me. I think if I let the light in or I let the air in, it's going to crumble in a sense. So, and also I think the verbal act of speaking about it and talking about it will somehow weaken the act of writing it. So I do keep it completely to myself. That said, you know, I don't even tell people that I've started really, but the other day I have a writing studio in the garden, and I was actually writing something new. And my don't tell anyone, my 13-year-old daughter, I suddenly saw her kind of walking back and forth in front of the window, and she was on her phone, and I was thinking, that's odd, I wonder what she's doing. And then a minute later I got this text message, and it says, I know you started. So there are no secrets with teenagers in the house.
That's excellent. Well, another thing that's come out in our conversations previously is that Maggie is a very private person, and something that your husband said to you, likes to joke about you in terms of being the most secretive person he knows. And would you like to tell that story? You want to tell it?
I don't know what the story is, but my husband says that he said when he knew I was talking to Liz, he said, "What are you going to say to her? Because you never tell anyone anything." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Look, when you leave the house, I see you putting on your coat." And he says, "I know you're probably just going to the post office." He said, "But I say to you, where are you going?" And I always just say, "I'm going out." And I really am. It's not as if I'm going out to have an affair. I am actually just going to the corner shop to buy milk. But I just think, well, why are you asking me?
And yet, she has written a memoir, which I find fascinating. And when I first heard this, I was like, really? Private person writing a memoir. But for those who haven't read it, so I Am, 17 Brushes with Death is indeed about 17 brushes with death. And they range from sort of risks you took as a teenager to a very serious bout of encephalitis you had when you were 8, which left her partially paralyzed for about a year. And then the final chapter deals with her daughters, one of her daughters has very serious food allergies. And it's fascinating about this book is that, you know, you, as a reader, you're allowed into the kind of the very emotional and intellectual core of these really terrifying events. But like, I have no idea what your husband eats for breakfast, you know? And like, I know nothing about your marriage, and I know nothing about your children except that one of them has allergies, and that's sort of it. And it was a very, from a sort of, you know, just in the way it was constructed, it's sort of fascinating to read that, where you're really in these moments, but yet there's still that privacy, and I wonder how you thought about that, and if that was a conscious thought as you were executing it.
Well, I always thought I would never write a memoir. In fact, I used to joke about it. You know, I'm as likely to do X as I am to write a memoir. So I was slightly disconcerted when I realised that the thing that I was writing was, in fact, about myself. You know, I wasn't even writing a kind of, you know, auto-fiction. It was me, and it was my life. And so for quite a long time, I really resisted it. And I sort of thought, well, I'll just write it, and then I'll go on and you know, write my next book, which was going to be Hamnet. But it was, you know, and it was odd, but I think I suppose it goes back to what I was saying about, you know, you have to write the book that you can't not write. And if you find yourself writing a book, you know, that's obviously the book you can't not write. That's the one that is insisting on being written. So, no, I was quite disconcerted. And when I discussed it with my editor, and she read some of the pages, and she said, yes, great, you know, we'll go ahead. And we had to kind of do a contract. And I said to her, I don't want any money for it, because, you know, I don't know if I can finish it, and I don't know if I've finished it, you know, whether or not I'm going to want to publish it. And so she said, well, you have to have some money in order to make this legally binding. And so I said, okay, I'll have £1. That's all I'm going to take there. I should say she has paid me now. I don't want to malign the poor woman. But that's all I want to take. But I think in a sense, you know, I think what worried me most actually about writing a memoir wasn't so much what I would expose about myself, but I really didn't want to write the kind of book that became attacks on my friends and family, you know, because I mean I love reading memoirs, but sometimes I read them and it, you know, it literally takes my breath away, some of the revelations in it, not only so much about the writer, but about the people in their lives.
You read them and you're like, oh, your poor mother, oh God. Yeah.
And how did your husband ever speak to you again, or do your children? Do you think about your children reading it? You know, I find it amazing what some writers will reveal. But in a sense, the kind of structure I came up with, so that the memoir isn't organised chronologically, it's organised in terms of body part. And that structure, in a way, allows you to, you know, it allows you to narrate quite a lot, but it allows you to conceal anything you perhaps don't want to tell people. So there's an awful lot that isn't in the book, obviously. I mean, that structure, if it's non-chronological, you you can skip 5 years when not anything particularly interesting happened, but you can also preserve the privacy, actually, of people in your life. So nobody in the book is named, not my children, not my friends. I think my husband's actually the only person who has his actual name in the book. Just because I felt, I mean, actually nobody had said to me, I don't want my name in the book, but I just felt it was right. I'm not sure how I would have felt really appearing in someone's memoir. So, I suppose the structure, in a sense, it freed me up to tell the stories that I wanted to tell, but keep the ones back that I didn't. I think with all memoirs, there are hidden, submerged narratives, aren't there? And sometimes those are the interesting guesswork you can do in them.
Will you tell the story of the trolley, please?
Okay, I'll tell the story of the trolley.
Thank you.
So as I said, I paid £1. I mean, that was my advance for this my memoir. And I don't know if you know, but when you go to a supermarket, or yes, you say grocery store here? Supermarket. Yeah, supermarket. In the UK, in order to get a shopping trolley, you have to put £1 in a slot, a £1 coin in a slot. And then you can sort of unchain it and you can carry on. So when I was doing this about a week after I'd signed the contract for my memoir, and I took a photograph of the trolley and I sent it to my agent, my editor, and I said, look, I've spent all my advance.
Thank you for humoring me. I enjoyed that story. So the book that came after that was Hamnet, which I think probably many or most people in this audience have read, but would you mind telling people about it if they have not?
So Hamnet is, as you might be able to guess, the story of Shakespeare's 11-year-old son who died. And so he died about 5 years or so before Shakespeare went on to write Hamlet. And I think I always felt, and that was one of those books that really had a very long gestational period. I originally heard about Shakespeare's son, Hamlet, when I was studying Hamlet at school, so I was probably about 16. And I'm not saying that when I was 16 I thought, one day I shall write a novel. It was nothing like that at all. I just remember being intrigued by the almost, the sort of almost parallel names, and wondering, then I wonder what, I remember I have a clear memory of looking at the cover of my school issue play and putting my finger over the L and taking it off again, thinking, well, it's the same name, and what does that mean? What does it mean for a man to have called this play and this character and this ghost, let's not forget, after his dead son? What does that say? And so it was only later that when I realised that I sort of had the idea that I might write a novel about it, but for a long time I did think, who writes a novel about Shakespeare? What an insane idea. Why would anyone do that? And also I had a strange superstition about it, in that I knew in order to write this book that I was going to have to put myself inside the skin of a woman who has to sit by her son's bedside and is forced to watch him die. And I knew I just didn't want to do it until my own son was past the age of 11. It was a really strange and very strong superstition. Not that there was an enormous chance of my son catching the Black Death, but you never know, you can't be too careful. So I did put that off quite a lot. My son actually used to joke that he would never have a 12th birthday party because I would be so busy upstairs starting a novel. But I would like to say that's not true. He did have a party.
There's one thing in the maybe the author's note at the beginning also mentioned that Shakespeare never wrote about the plague, right? And that's so interesting. And so wondering, like, what that would have been very large holes, in that period of time. And so why not? So I thought that was fascinating. And my experience of reading that book was just sobbing, like not like cute little tears, just like ugly crying, like on my couch. I immediately finished the book and then like told like many of my friends to go read it, and so they could also ugly cry. And your husband said something funny about this as well. Her husband's very funny, as you can tell. And he said, people come up to Maggie and they say like, "Oh, your book was like a knife in my heart. Oh, I loved it. Thank you." Normally you think maybe that person had done something wrong, but like actually it's great. But yeah, you sort of mentioned the having to sit with that, like having to write that. Like I could barely read it, and I'm very impressed. Like how do you go there every day?
Well, I think in a sense, I wanted Hamlet's death to feel significant. I wanted the reader to feel it, because one of the engines behind the book for me was the sense that I've always thought that Hamlet the boy has never been given his due. He's never been given his significance. You know, I think without him, we wouldn't have the play Hamlet, and we probably wouldn't have Twelfth Night, I mean, without his death. But also, whenever I read, I studied English literature at university, and whenever I read biographies or works of scholarship about Shakespeare, Hamlet is lucky if he gets maybe 2 mentions. They mention that he was born, he was a twin with his sister Judith, and they mention that he died. And often his death was wrapped up in statistics about child mortality, which the inference of which seemed to be that actually it wasn't really that big of a deal because lots of children died then, you know, which seems such a terrible thing to suggest.
It's bananas.
Yeah, and I've actually read a very respected Shakespearean scholar say, you know, it's impossible to know whether or not Shakespeare grieved when Hamlet died. At which point I just thought, you know, what are you talking about? You know, this child was 11. Of course he was, you know, not only, you know, I just refuse to believe that however common child mortality was, you know, whatever point in the world, wherever you are, at any time, it's anything less than devastating to lose a child. I just refuse to believe that. And also, you know, I wanted to say to these people, have you read Hamlet? You know, have you read the opening scenes, you know, where the father is dead and the son is alive and the son is grieving and desperate to see the ghost of his father, desperate. He's so upset he can't, you know, he's still wearing his cloaks of, you know, he's still wearing his black clothes months after it's appropriate, and, you know, the whole play is filled with this chasm of grief, and I wonder where that came from. I wonder. So I just felt, so in a sense I felt frustrated, you know, I wanted to say to people, this child lived and he was important, and of course he was grieved, and, you know, the idea that a writer would casually take the name of his dead son and give it to this play is nonsense. Of course, any writer would think really carefully about that, and you wouldn't just take the name of your dead son in vain, you know. So I suppose I wanted his death to feel significant. But that said, you know, those writing the scene where, I mean, it's not a spoiler to say this if anyone hasn't read it, but the scene where Hamnet dies and then is laid out for burial, they were, I think, probably the hardest things I've ever written, just because of the place you had to go, you know, and I wanted, you know, in order, I think if you are going to choose to write a novel or fiction about people who were real, you have to always remember that. You've got to be respectful and mindful of that. So I did, you know, so I wanted those things to feel real, but they were hard, and I actually had to write them outside the house. I couldn't write them in the house where my children live, and I didn't have my writing studio at this point. So I wrote them in this really horrible old potting shed in the garden, which has since blown down. And I would sit there, and I'd do it in about 10 or 15-minute bursts, and I'd have a little walk around the garden, and I'd come back and do it. They weren't easy to write, but I think maybe they're not easy to read either. But in a way, I wanted to respect the memory of Hamlet and say, you know, this child's death was significant.
And one thing that's very interesting about the book is you never use William Shakespeare's name. You know, there's no Will, there's no William, nothing. But the book is dedicated to Will. Now, what has happened with that? And who's Will? Also, who's that?
Some people have said to me, "Is it dedicated to Shakespeare?" It isn't. My husband is Will, which is confusing. But also, to which people I want to say, would I call him Will if it was William Shakespeare? This guy. I'm just going to use his nickname because we're in first name. So, no, I have had to keep quite a straight face when interviewers have asked me that. I have to say, no, actually, my husband is called Will. It's dedicated to him, obviously.
And some people have not believed you, am I right?
Yeah, there was one person who was really insistent and said, no, but it is, isn't it? It's Shakespeare. And I had to say, I promise you, I can show you my husband's passport, which I have on my phone. He's the Will. You know, the idea that I would just use, you know, address Shakespeare by a nickname, it's really bizarre.
He's your buddy. It's great. And I know the other sort of really central character in the book is Shakespeare's wife, who it's spelled Agnes. How do you actually pronounce that? Because it's not...
Well, I think then it was pronounced closer to the French, which is Agnes or Anis. But I found it a little bit distracting to call it. It was a bit confusing, so I always just referred to myself as Agnes. But okay. Agnes, Anis, you know.
Let's call it Agnes. Okay. And so what were you sort of hoping to do with that character? I mean, this is a... you know, she's among the main interesting things about her, she's sort of magical. You know, she can sort of see the future, kind of, and it's so fascinating, and it works so well. And I'm just curious, sort of why that? What were you hoping for her? Kind of what was her role to be, and what were you hoping to write about her, and why the magic?
Well, I originally conceived the novel, I think, as to be about fathers and sons and absence and presence, as the play Hamlet is. But actually, during my research, I became, I suppose, somewhat sidetracked, or actually maybe the better word is enraged, by the way that I have felt the woman Shakespeare married is being treated. And by, this is by everybody, historians and scholars and other novelists and writers of Oscar-winning screenplays, not mentioning any names. And I've always felt that we've been pushed one single narrative about her for hundreds of years now, and that is that she was this older, ignorant, illiterate peasant who lured this younger boy genius into marriage, and that he hated her, that he had to run away to London to get away from her, and he regretted his marriage. And I have to say that I've read, I think, most books about Shakespeare in print, and I can't find a single shred of evidence to this. It's just this kind of strange urge to give the bard a retrospective divorce, and I don't know where it comes from. I don't know why. The only explanation I can think of is it's just old-fashioned misogyny. It's really peculiar. And her detractors will always say, well, of course, his famous behest in his will, I leave unto my wife my second best bed. But actually what her detractors never say is that the second best bed in Elizabethan times, in Elizabethan England, was the marriage bed, was the marital bed that they would have shared. And the best bed was the one that was in the parlour downstairs, and that was for visitors. And they also never say that if you look at Shakespeare's will, that behest is an interlineation. It's squeezed in between two other lines. And by law, she was entitled to a third of his estate, which actually was enormous. When he died, he was almost the equivalent of a multi-millionaire. And she could also have the right to live on in their mansion of a house. So the idea that she's this kind of rejected wife thrown out on the road with a bed to her name is preposterous. She was incredibly wealthy and very privileged, and she was left a marriage bed. But also, I think what's always been key to me is that at the end of his life, when he retired, he'd had this hugely successful career on the stage, and he was very wealthy and could have lived anywhere he wanted in the whole world, but he chose to go back to Stratford-upon-Avon and live with her, which is not the act of a man who hates his wife or regrets his marriage, is it? So I suppose I was so furious about this, the way she's been treated and the way she's been so criticised and vilified for so long, that I thought, well, actually, maybe their marriage maybe they loved each other. Maybe their marriage was a partnership, and yes, obviously he was spending a lot of time in London because that's where his work was, but that doesn't mean he hated her, and his work is filled with incredibly faithful, much beloved wives. And I suppose the kind of idea of her being her sort of slight supernatural powers, which I think I tried to leave, slightly ambiguous. She believes in them, others don't. There is so much soothsaying and prophecy and magical women in his plays. I just thought, well, I wonder where that came from. So I decided to give that to her. But also things like the scene. I've always found the scene where Ophelia goes mad in Hamlet very, very potent and very odd. It seems to come from nowhere. And I often wonder, one of the things she says is, he is dead and gone, lady, he is dead and gone. And I've always wondered if that is Shakespeare looking at his wife, who's deranged by grief for her son. And the idea of the scene where she hands plants to people is written from a point of, it's a very informed point of view. All the plants that Ophelia gives to somebody are slightly barbed cures for a flaw that she perceives in their character. So obviously Shakespeare knew what he was writing about when he wrote that. But I just, and that was always, I read anyway, that every house would have had a medicinal healing garden in it, and it was usually the role of the woman in the household. And so I just had this, slightly fanciful imagining of him writing that scene and then shouting to his wife, "What is it we use rosemary for? What do we use? Why do we have curry?" So I just wondered whether, obviously, it's just speculation, but the idea that you can see his domestic life weaving through his plays.
Did you grow a garden yourself?
She knows the answer to this. Yeah. So one of the things I did for Hamnet was, obviously there's no shortage of books about Shakespeare. You can spend your whole life reading about him, and lots of people do. But I felt as particularly to properly bring to life Agnes, his wife, I needed to kind of do a different kind of research to sort of get my hands dirty in a way. So one of the things I did was to learn to fly a kestrel. I learnt falconry, which was actually the best thing I've ever done in the name of work. But I also planted and grew and cultivated my own Elizabethan medicinal garden. I still have it, actually. And I went on a course to learn how to make those plants into traditional medicines. Just because, I think there's only so much you can learn from reading a book, but you have to, in order to really understand how to make a poultice or to make a tincture, you have to literally get your hands dirty. You have to get the plants and you chop them up and you macerate them and you soak them in alcohol or whatever. So, I mean, I think, especially if you're going to write historically, I think there is a sense that you can do possibly too much research. I never like those historical novels where it feels weighted, the narrative feels weighted down with the reader's homework, in a sense. They want to prove to you that they've done all their homework and they've got full marks. So, but I feel that I need to know things like that to give me confidence to create a scene where someone is, prescribing herbal medicines or talking to somebody in a parlour. But in a sense, in your final draft, you have to make sure that, it's the opposite of what maths teachers tell you. Don't show your workings. You need to make sure that all your research is almost invisible.
And the falconry research, what was it you said that you had it landing with a thunk on her arm, but actually they're very gentle? So
I'd already written a scene where Agnes is flying her falcon, her kestrel. And I should say actually that was inspired by the plays themselves. There's a lot of hawking metaphors, particularly in Hamlet and also in, I think it's Taming of the Shrew. And I just like the idea that maybe he got the idea. So I gave the falconry to her, and I had written the scene already, or a kind of very bad draft of the scene, and I described a kestrel landing on her falcon glove, her hawking glove, with a thunk or a thud. And then when I went down to the borders in Scotland near where I live, and I met this amazing falconer who had all these different birds, and she let me try, I think I tried an osprey, and then I tried a golden eagle, which was terrifying, absolutely huge and really heavy. And there's a photo of me going like this, as far away as I possibly can from it. And then I flew the kestrel, and I thought, no, this is the one, because they're so beautiful, kestrels. But she showed me how to fly, and it went off into the trees, and then it arrived back on my glove. But honestly, it's about the weight of a newborn kitten. And when it arrives, it's 1 minute it's there, and the next minute it's gone, and the next minute it's back again, and you wouldn't even notice, which obviously is what makes it such a brilliant predator. So I had to go home and rewrite that and really take out any hint of it being a thud. But you only know that if you actually do it.
That's great. I gotta write a story about a kestrel, so I can try that. I gotta work that out. Let's see. So one thing that your husband said about one of your traits as a writer is your stamina. And sort of, at a point he said, when everyone else would be like, oh God, I'm so sick of this, I can't look at it anymore, I mean, go away, you keep at it. And that's, part of how it works for you. Can you talk to me about that?
I don't know, I'm not really sure what he means, but I think maybe what he's referring to is the fact that I really believe in redrafting. I write the first draft, that's just for me. And when I get to the end of the first draft, I think of it as raw material, as a sculptor might look at a lump of clay. I know my book's in there somewhere, but there's going to be a lot of work before I'm able to get it out. And so drafts 2 and 3, I would just be working on that. And so my husband probably reads draft 4, and then my editor and agent might read draft 6 or 7, and then it keeps going. So, I suppose there are writers who are planners. I have heard other writers talk about how they will plan exactly what goes in each chapter and each part of the novel before they even start writing, but I'm very much the opposite, I think. I like to kind of feel the shape of the novel while I'm in it. I can't think about it really in the abstract. I have to be writing it. I have to be engaged on the task to understand what it is that I want to do or I want to say. So maybe that. But and also there is always the sense as well that I find it really hard to actually relinquish a final draft. There is a sense that you could go on writing the same book. You could go on fiddling around with your semicolons. And actually, if you look, this is the reading copy of my book, I actually can't stop writing it because this is filled with
You don't like that
amendments
page?
amendments that I wish I'd made and edits that I wish I'd made. So, I think you do need someone trusted to literally wrestle the manuscript out of your grasp and say, right, that's enough. You've been at this for 3 years, and now it's time to let it go.
Well, I think we're going to get to questions in just a second, but is there anything that I haven't asked you about that I should have, or anything about the marriage portrait you want to mention? No is an acceptable answer, and then it could be their problem to ask the questions.
I can't think. I never know what to say when people say that. Is there anything you want to say? And I think, I have no idea.
No, nothing. Everything. Okay, so I think we're at time for questions in that case.
Questions? Hands?
We can keep talking.
I apologize because I know the answer to this, but it's just such a good story. I want to hear it again. Can you tell the story about visiting Lucrezia's tomb?
Yes. So when I suppose I should say that I wrote the marriage portrait slightly counterintuitively. I think if the world, I had the idea in February 2020, and if the world had been, I don't need to tell you what happened after that, but if the world had been working normally, I would have gone quite quickly to Italy to have a look, do some sort of on-the-ground research and walk around the locations. But of course, nobody was going anywhere in March 2020. So I wrote the book and then had to do that kind of research at the end, which I was quite nervous about because it didn't feel right at all. I wanted, and I used to live quite near Florence, so I knew Florence a bit, and I'd been to the Palazzo Vecchio, which is where Lucrezia was born and spent her childhood, but I'd never set foot in Ferrara, where she went to Ferrara at the age of 15 to start her marriage, and then a year later she was dead. So I was nervous about that because I have an absolute strict rule that I would never write about anywhere that I'd never been. So I did go to Ferrara, and this was about September 2021, just at the time where travel restrictions were lifted. And it was an incredibly complicated a feat at that time to go anywhere. I mean, it involved more admin than actually when I bought my house. So I went to Ferrara, and I think what I hadn't been prepared for was the emotional connection that you form with the character over the 2 years or whatever of writing the book. And I visited the Castello where she spent her last few months of her life, and I also wanted to visit her tomb. And all the D'Estes, Alfonso and the Duke of Ferrara, and all the D'Estes and Lucrezia are buried in this mausoleum in a monastery in the south of the city. And I went there, and it's this huge kind of high-walled brick building, completely shuttered up with this incredibly heavy sort of iron-studded door, and I had to ring this bell, which sort of tinkled very far off inside the building, which is all very sort of on brand somehow for a Renaissance family. And eventually this tiny nun came to the door and opened the door, and I explained to her in my very poor Italian why I was there, and I wanted to see the tomb of Lucrezia de Medici. And she let me come in, and she and her sisters showed me to this other tomb, and it was Lucrezia Borgia, who is, of course, a very famous Renaissance woman who happens to be Alfonso's grandmother. And I said, no, I want to see Lucrezia de Medici. And they said, well, here it is. And I said, and there was this kind of very confusing conversation. And I said, no, Lucrezia de Medici. And they seemed very taken aback. And then they said to me, nobody has ever asked to see the grave of Lucrezia de Medici. And I was so upset because I thought, here is this 16-year-old girl who died far away from her family, on her own, possibly murdered by her husband. And it seemed so upsetting. So actually, I cried, which is so embarrassing. But it was a very, very hot day, and I was slightly overwrought, and it was very humid, so my hair was looking really quite mental. And I had brought flowers, and I was putting them on the grave while I was weeping, and I turned around, and there was this line of tiny nuns all going, what? Who is this woman, and why is she crying about this duchess who's been dead for 500 years? It's quite embarrassing. They were very kind to me, though. They brought me a handkerchief. But they also thought I was really deranged.
Ms. O'Farrell, I just want to say that there were 2 books that I sobbed over, Dr. Zhivago and your book, Hamnet. But also I wanted to ask you, George Eliot had written Romola. Did that work have any bearing on this new book, The Marriage Portrait?
I love George Eliot. I really do, and I think my favourite is Daniel Deronda, which I think, most people say Middlemarch, which of course, I'm not criticising Middlemarch, and I never would, but I love Daniel Deronda, and I do love Romola as well. Interestingly, I think Lucrezia's older sister, Isabella de' Medici, who's probably quite famous, as an arts patron, her middle name is Romola. So I'm sure that George Eliot knew that, that thing, but no, I love that book. It's fantastic. I did reread it as I was writing this one, so yeah, you're a very astute reader.
Hi, thank you again for writing such a beautiful book. Really enjoyed it. A group of us were having dinner before we came over here, and we realized that we have very different perceptions of the ending of the book.
Can I just say you have to be very careful not to put any spoilers.
I didn't even think of that. Well, did you intentionally mean the ending to be ambiguous, or is there room for interpretation there? Because half of us thought it went one way, and half of us thought it went the other way.
Okay, thank you for being so careful about that. I was at a reading last week when a woman just came out with the ending, and it was awful because everyone around her just kind of roared at her. I actually felt really bad for her because she was so embarrassed. Anyway, so not to give any spoilers about the ending. Yes, I did. I always knew that I wanted to end it the way it is ended. I've got to speak very carefully when I say this. But I wasn't sure if I could pull it off, in a sense. But I think, yes, it's open to different. I'm happy for it to be open to different interpretations. So I suppose what I wanted to do with it, even though right at the start of the book, I state that Lucrezia dies at the age of 16, a year after she's married, and there were rumours that Alfonso had poisoned her. But I think history is a bit ambiguous about that itself. There are some historians who say that she died of natural causes, I suppose I wanted the ending to be. I suppose what I would say is that you can never be sure about what's going to happen. That kind of it's hard to talk about. But I think I suppose when I started the novel, I wanted to be. I thought I should be quite even-handed with Alfonso. I didn't want to condemn a man who hasn't been put on trial for and I thought there are people who say he murdered her and people who say he didn't. So I thought I should be circumspect about it. But then in the course of my research, I found out something that an incident that Alfonso was quite proud of, he was quite happy for people to know, was that when he discovered his sister was having an affair with the head of the guardsmen at his castello, he sentenced the man to be strangled, and he forced his sister to watch. And I remember closing the cover of the book where I read that, and I had this kind of weird, sort of horrible feeling up my spine, and I remember consciously thinking, right, Alfonso, the gloves are off.
Hi. I just want to ask about what Liz had mentioned earlier, your choice to not name Shakespeare in Hamnet. Could you talk a little bit about that choice?
Sure. Yes, it seemed to me that the novel Hamnet was very much to do with names. The sort of very closeness of Hamnet and Hamlet, and how actually in Elizabethan spelling, which was much less stable, it is the same name. There are plenty. It was used interchangeably. There are plenty of parish records where the spelling veers between the two, and also the name of Agnes. We know her as Anne Hathaway, which is weird because actually her name was Shakespeare for most of her life. But one of the documents I read was her father's will. He died a year before she married William, and in it he leaves her a very generous dowry, and he names her as my daughter Agnes, which I found absolutely astonishing. I thought, surely if anyone is going to know her real name, it's going to be her father. And why is it we've been calling her this for the last... It just seemed very symbolic of the way she's been, I think anyway, really misunderstood and misinterpreted for so long. But actually there were lots of reasons why I didn't want to use the name William Shakespeare. It's partly because when I was writing the novel, I found that I just couldn't write a sentence like William Shakespeare came down the stairs and had his breakfast. You know, I just... Every time I started to type it, I think, oh, come on, what are you doing? This is a really bad idea. And I thought, well, if I can't stay submerged in the narrative, I can't expect a reader to. And so I tried William, and I thought, no, that seems really wrong. And Will, which I just thought, no, it seems really, really wrong. And so I just found that I thought it was distracting me. So in a sense, I wanted readers to think about him before he was William Shakespeare, you know, before he was the literary behemoth. So I just thought, I'm just going to do away with it altogether. And also, I think there is a sense that you need to differentiate, I think, between characters, fictional characters that are based on real people, and the real people who are buried in Stratford-upon-Avon churchyard or a tomb in Ferrara. And in a sense, you know, the surname Medici doesn't appear in this book, and Shakespeare doesn't appear in Hamnet. It just felt like a sort of a mark of respect, in a sense, you know, that this is a novel and they were the real people.
Hi, Maggie. I'm in the back row, but I am a huge fan. And I found your book, I Am, after listening to you on NPR, and I, of course, went immediately and read the book. And it's beautiful, and I've read everything since, but I had no idea. I'm reading these stories, and the very last story, Daughter, just hit me like a semi-truck hit me. It was the most beautiful thing. I also have a child with terrible food allergies, and what you did was gave me a gift that I was then able to give to the people that I love who cannot understand what it is, and it's the book that I would take with me on a desert island. It is my favorite book, and I just needed to say thank you for that, and I just wanted you to know, thank you.
Thank you. I think mums who deal with very severe food allergies, we're sisters under the skin. So thank you.
Hi, Maggie. Thank you for being with us tonight. I've read several of your books, and I feel like a recurring theme is life's cut short. And I wondered if that's something that is particular for you, or if we'll ever have any of your characters that live a nice long life.
Well, I think you know, I've written a book, a memoir about brushes with death. So I think it is something that interests me, you know, and I think any brush that we have with mortality, and obviously, you know, I think we all have them, some more serious than others, and obviously some of us more instances of that than others, but I think those moments do change you, and that's what I wrote the book about, the idea that any experience where you feel you might have died or you know that you nearly died, no matter how trivial or serious, because obviously there's a huge range, I think they do change you. I think they take up residence inside you, and I think in those moments where you feel under threat, I think there is a kind of accounting that goes on in your head. You think about all the things that you'd stand to lose, and all the things that would be, you know, the places in life where you would leave a hole, you know, if you went. So I think they really change us, and I think we come back from whatever brink a different person. We come back a bit wiser and a bit more melancholy, in a sense, and you become very aware of life's fragility. So, and then that interests me. You know, I think one of the conversations that I found fascinating, that I kept having again and again after I published that book, was that people would say to me, I can't believe you had 17. I haven't had any. I haven't had any at all. And then during that conversation, that people would say, actually, you know what? There was that one time, and then there was another time. And you know, I think it is something which I think some people will put away and not want to think about again. But even if they're not thinking about it, they are consciously not thinking about it. It's still there in you, isn't it? I think it still changes you.
I'm just curious, in your fiction, what prompted the shift from contemporary fiction to historical fiction with Hamnet, and then you seem to be going down that road, obviously with the marriage portrait as well. It's a very startling and significant shift?
Well, it's funny. I think when I was writing Hamnet, I tried really consciously not to think too much about the idea that I was writing a historical capital H novel capital N. I tried really carefully to approach it as I would any other type of book. I didn't want to write the kind of, like as I was saying, I didn't want to write the kind of book that wore its history very heavily. I think those are the kind of historical books that I enjoy myself, historical novels, the ones that are very light on the research side. And I suppose, in a sense, I've always felt that it's not necessarily you who choose the books seem to choose you. You have to, I leave it up to what Rudyard Kipling called the other side of your head. The decision about what to write next, you've almost got to leave it up to a kind of instinct in a sense, which does make me sound a bit insane, I realise, but I've always felt that's the kind of best guiding principle to go with. And I don't really feel that I deserve the appellation historical novelist. There are novelists who've spent their whole career devoted to that genre. But in a sense also, I don't think it's very useful or good for you to think I am writing a book and it's going to be on X shelves in a bookshop. I think you have to just go with it, and you have to write the story that you want to tell.
Any other questions? Back there. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Hi, first I just wanted to say that it's been like an amazing experience reading your books and now hearing you speak about them. So thank you for all that you do. I really enjoy your work. So for both Hamnet and now The Marriage Portrait, you've kind of taken historical figures and then given them like new personalities. So I was just wondering where you got the inspiration for their personalities, and they're such well-developed characters. So I was just wondering if there was like where you drew your character design from.
Well, I think if you are going to write about people who were real, even if it was 400, 500 years ago, you owe it to them in a sense to do as much research as you possibly can. And to be honest, there isn't a huge amount known about Lucrezia. She is someone whose history has been written in water, really. We know when she was born, and we know she went to Ferrara to be married to Alfonso at 15, and we know that she was dead at 16. And there are glimpses of her in her parents' letters, particularly. So her parents were Cosimo de' Medici. He was the Grand Duke of Tuscany, and his wife Eleonora di Toledo. And I think very unusually for people of their class and time, they really loved each other. Their marriage was pretty much arranged, as Lucrezia's was, but I think they lucked out, to be honest. They adored each other. And when they were apart, they wrote a lot of letters to each other. And obviously there's an awful lot of kind of fiscal and political dealings that go on in these letters about Tuscany, the region, but there's also quite intriguing glimpses of their domestic life in the Palazzo Vecchio. So-and-so's grown out of their shoes, somebody else isn't practicing their musical instruments enough. There are quite a lot of glimpses of Lucrezia and her brothers and sisters, and it's very clear that Cosimo really favoured Isabella, and it's very clear that Eleonora really favoured the boys. She was certainly painted with her sons quite a lot. But Lucrezia doesn't really get much of a mention. It's a bit heartbreaking. There's one mention of her saying that she's a bit of a daydreamer and doesn't concentrate much in her lessons. But apart from that, it's very sketchy, her life. So I just got the impression of her as someone somewhat underloved and undernoticed, actually. But of course, the Medicis are, there's an awful lot about them. And visually, that time in history is so present in ours. There's so much architecture and art and sculpture and painting from that time that we can see. So in a sense, I suppose I think those kind of gaps, though, for a scholar or a historian are probably quite frustrating, but for a novelist, they can be, or you could look at them as an opportunity, to fill with whatever story you yourself want to tell. So obviously the Lucrezia in my novel is probably, I would imagine, someone very different from what she was, but I tried to find whatever I could about her and to use that.
Thank you. Hi, Maggie. Also, just thank you for your work. I loved your memoir so much. It's my favourite memoir. I wondered whether writing those personal narratives changed the way you then approached your fictional characters, whether there was anything surprising that came out of writing a memoir that shifted your fiction writing in any way?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure I've ever been asked that before. I think people used to ask, I think I was always slightly surprised actually when people would ask me, why is it you always write about death? I used to think, I don't write about death, what are you talking about? And then I read Memoir and I thought, okay, maybe that maybe that explains it. And also I remember a lot of people have said that they expected me to be a really kind of gloomy person, I know, as if I'm going to arrive with a raven on my shoulder, dragging a kind of bell, wearing a lot of black. Certainly I've had phases in my teens when I did look a bit like that, but yes, I don't, you know, I suppose writing that memoir made me realise that actually there's, you know, I think coming close to death as a child is obviously a very profound experience, and knowing that you were very close to death. But I think I've always viewed, ever since that moment, I think I've always viewed my life actually as a complete bonus. You know, I feel incredibly lucky. I don't feel unlucky at all. I feel quite the opposite. So lucky to still be here, you know, and thanks to many physiotherapists and doctors, you know, I'm able to live an independent life, which is not something they thought I was at some point, they thought I ever would at some point. So I feel so blessed. I feel like I've had the luck of 1,000, you know, the luck of 1,000 really. So rather than feeling angry about what happened to me, I just feel so lucky that it could have been so much worse.
I think it's the end of the question. I just have one small question. Have your kids read your books?
Well, my son, I mean, actually, 2 of my kids are a bit too young, really, to read them. And my son has read some of them, not all of them. He did read the memoir, but he was quite young at the time, and I was a little bit anxious because I thought, you know, it's not, do you really want to read all this about your mum? But it's very, I would never pull a book out of a child's hand, so obviously I didn't. He was probably about 15 at the time. And during lockdown, he found lockdown quite hard, which, you know, for a 16-year-old boy, I completely got it. You know, what 16-year-old wants to be told he's got to stay in the house with his parents for 2 years? So he did have, for a while he had a bit of a habit of, one of the things he used to entertain himself with was pick up a copy of Hamnet, which I don't leave lying around. He would go and find one, and he would open it at any page, and he would read aloud in a very silly Shakespearean voice, whatever he found on that page, until one day he chanced on, I don't know if anyone has read it, there's a scene in an Apple store. It's a love scene. And he started reading that, and I let him go on for that paragraph, and I said, you do realise that's a sex scene? And I have never seen anyone drop a book so fast in their life. Who wants to read a sex scene written by their mum? So he did actually, after he took him about a year to recover from that, obviously, and he did read it then. But then, I love teenagers, they're so funny. He came in and he put it on my desk and he went, yeah, it's quite good.
I think a round of applause is what we need. I want to thank you both. Thank you both. It's been a fascinating conversation. Loved every minute of it. I missed the beginning because I was helping people in and out. I'm going to get home and watch the replay as soon as I get it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Liz, for coming out as well. Great. I also want to thank Josie from Knopf and the Knopf team, and also all of the staff here at the UU for helping us put on this event today. And I know this is your last event in the US, you're back. So we're privileged that you are here for the last event. Thank you. And I want to thank all of our sponsors. Look, I'm right by the sign here. Thank you to all of our sponsors, many of whom are here tonight. And we have a lot of partners and community organisations in Montclair who help us, and we want to thank them tonight. Thank you so much for helping us to put on all of our festival and our events. And just before I go, I wanted to mention our next event, which is on November 15th. We have Hugh Bonneville, beloved British TV and film actor from Downton Abbey and Paddington. He'll be coming to Montclair from Downton to darkest Peru to Montclair. No, he's going to be here to talk about his memoir, Playing Under the Piano, From Downton Abbey to Darkest Peru, and tickets are on sale now. You can either find the link on our social media or on our website, and we hope to see you on November 15th for that. And now I think you're going to sign a few books, the unsigned books. I think we're going to do it right there. Do you need something, though, apart from a pen and maybe your stamp? Oh, you have everything. So thank you all for coming. Thank you.